Winter in the Cascade Mountains is brutal and isolating, with the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and the vast, unbroken silence that can play tricks on the mind. In this remote wilderness, 3 men, Roy Wilson, Dewey Morris, and Ed Nichols, sought to make a living through fur trapping. But by the time the snow melted in the spring of 1924, they were dead, and their gruesome murder would become one of Oregon's most chilling unsolved mysteries. This is the story of the Lava Lake murders. Hello, friends. My name is Marcia, and this is Midwest Murders. In the early 20th century, life for fur trappers in Oregon was rugged and often solitary, defined by isolation, hard labor, and survival skills honed to endure the harsh winter conditions. This was a time before easy access to roads, regular communication, or modern amenities. Much of Oregon was still wilderness, especially the central and eastern regions, where winters could be brutal and temperatures often dipped well below freezing. Fur trappers worked trap lines as a way to supplement their income, living out of small, modest cabins in remote areas, often covering miles of rugged terrain each day to check traps and collect animals. Fur-bearing animals like martens, beavers, foxes, and coyotes were in demand, and their pelts fetched high prices. Communication with the outside world was rare, as they were physically separated from the nearest town by miles of forest, mountain, and often heavy snow. Mail and supplies could take weeks or even months to arrive, adding to the sense of isolation. This remoteness also provided fertile ground for unsavory characters, such as escaped convicts and outlaws, to hide. Conflicts between trappers and poachers were not uncommon, particularly as fur prices fluctuated and attracted people desperate for quick profits. In the Lava Lake area specifically, the secluded terrain created a natural stage for danger. Only a few other trappers or forest rangers might be nearby, and reports of murders, theft, and sudden disappearances circulated frequently, making many fur trappers suspicious of strangers. It was against this backdrop that 3 trappers, Roy Wilson, age 35, a former Marine and logger who worked for Brooks Scanlon Lumber Company, Dewey Morris, age 23, who was a co-worker at the lumber company, and Ed Nichols, a 55-year-old former co-worker, settled into an isolated cabin in October 1923 to trap animals, collect pelts, and tend to 5 silver foxes owned by Ed Logan and valued at between $2,000 and $3,000. Roy and Dewey had returned to visit their respective families in Bend, Oregon for the holidays from Christmas to New Year's Day. Roy had promised his mother, Sarah Wilson, that he would return home by February. But when February came and went and he didn't show, she knew something was terribly wrong. While she did raise the alarm, family assured her that the men were fine, probably having good luck trapping and deciding to continue for as long as they could. By early April, H.D. Innes also grew concerned over the silence of his brother-in-law Roy and tried to make the drive to the cabin with Charles Saylor. Car trouble forced them to abandon the plan, but 2 weeks later, Innes returned with Dewey's brother Owen Morris. They were able to make it to the cabin and found it deserted. Dishes from the breakfast meal were left on the table, and another meal had been left cooking on the stove, its molded contents indicating no one had been around for a while. An emaciated cat was still in the cabin. Food had been set out for the 5 foxes, but they were missing. The men's coats, hats, snowshoes, hand axes, and weapons were left in the cabin, along with adequate provisions. The calendar hanging on the wall still had the January page on it. 7 guns were known to be in the cabin: 2 rifles, 2 shotguns, a .22 Colt revolver, a .22 H&R revolver, and Roy's .38 caliber Luger. The Luger and Colt were missing. Innes and Morris immediately began searching for the missing men. A search of their trap lines indicated the trappers had not made their rounds for some time, with the remains of 12 marten, 4 foxes, and 1 skunk found dead in the traps. Returning to town, the men raised the alarm. Sheriff S.E. Roberts accompanied the men back to the cabin the following day. Empty 16-gauge shotgun shells and .38 caliber shells were found near the cabin, and a blood-stained hammer was found in the cabin. There were no signs of a struggle. A hat found in the cabin did not belong to the men and had been purchased at a Portland store. A half-mile from the cabin, the men's sled was found near the lake's edge with dark stains on it. Later testing would determine the stains to be human blood. Tracks leading from the sled out onto the lake ended at a hole cut through the ice big enough to stuff a body through. Due to the conditions, it was decided to wait until the ice naturally broke up in order to search the water. A blood-stained cloth and a sweater with smaller bloodstains was found in a cabin along one of the trap lines 6 miles from the scene. The sweater was identified as belonging to one of the men. The skinned bodies of the foxes were found near the cabin. All indications were that the trio had met with foul play. Investigators determined that a fresh supply of feed for the foxes had been purchased January 13th, but the amount left indicated the foxes had only been fed for 1 day after the purchase. Alan Wilcoxon, owner of the Elk Lake Resort, came forward to say he had stopped by the cabin on his way to check on his resort and visited with the 3 men on January 15th. He had taken an alternate route back from the resort and did not pass by the cabin on his return trip. He stated that all was well at the cabin during his visit. These 2 confirmed sightings would lead police to believe that the men disappeared on or about January 15th. On April 24th, about 10 days after the discovery of the deserted cabin, Ed Logan, Deputy Sheriff Clarence Adams, Ennis, and Owen Wilson returned to the cabin about 4 p.m. after again searching along the trap lines. Leaving Logan in the cabin to prepare supper, Ennis and Adams hiked over to Big Lava Lake, intending on catching fish for the evening meal. As they crossed over a pile of lava near the edge of the lake, they saw the bodies of the 3 men floating about 200 feet from shore. County physician R.W. Henderson performed the examination of the bodies. Dewey Morris was wounded with a shotgun and beaten in the head with a hammer. Roy Wilson's shoulder was torn by a shotgun blast, and a bullet entered his head behind the right ear. Ed Nichols' jaw was torn by a shotgun blast, and a .38 caliber bullet tore through his throat. The wounds indicated that all 3 had been shot from behind. Henderson reported that the bodies had been in the water at least a month, but it was impossible to determine exactly how much longer they had been there. All 3 men were in their short sleeves, and Nichols was wearing his reading glasses, which he only wore inside. His pocket watch had stopped at 9:10. The sheriff theorized that the men had been lured out of the cabin and were slain some distance from it. With the finding of empty shotgun shells in 2 spots outside the cabin where blood had stained the snow, it was believed Morris and Wilson were killed there. Toward the rear of the cabin was another blood-stained spot where a fragment of bone or tooth was found, indicating Nichols, who had been shot in the jaw, was killed there. Early in the investigation, Lee Collins became the prime suspect. He had been Ed's partner the previous winter, working with him on Logan's fur farm, tending to the foxes, with a promise of receiving some of the proceeds from the sale of the pelts. It would later be determined that Lee Collins was actually Charles Kimsey, an escaped convict from the Idaho Penitentiary, described as 5 feet 7 inches tall, 160 pounds, with scars on his nose, right cheek, and wrist. The partnership ended badly when Logan decided not to sell the foxes due to a downturn in the prices of the pelts. Kimsey would be charged with theft after taking a fur coat valued at $800 and $400 in cash. Ed provided information that nearly led to his apprehension, and Kimsey swore revenge. Logan would tell police that Ed was in constant fear of Kimsey's return. Further investigation turned up Carl Schumacher, a Portland fur dealer who reported that he had purchased 4 poorly handled fox furs on January 22nd from a man who gave his name as Ed Nichols and displayed a trapper's license made out to that name. He was unable to positively identify Kimsey, but said there was a similarity between him and the man who sold the furs. The furrier remembered 2 men, one friendly and talkative, and the other quiet and brooding. W.C. Bender, a traffic policeman, did positively identify Kimsey as one of 2 men carrying a gunny sack of furs who asked him for directions to a furrier in Portland on the same day. Kimsey managed to evade capture until 1932, when he was finally arrested in Montana for the assault of W.E. Harrison, a for-hire driver. While taking a break to relieve himself on the side of the road, an unseen accomplice hit Harrison from behind and, believing he was dead, tossed him into the cistern of a deserted cabin on Lost Chance Mountain. He survived and was able to positively identify Kimsey as the man who hired him, although he did not get a look at the accomplice. His car was later found in Idaho. While circumstantial evidence strongly implicated Kimsey, no hard evidence was ever found and no charges were ever filed against him for the murders. Kimsey always maintained his innocence. There were other suspects in the killing of the 3 trappers, including 2 men who had passed through the area in the winter and had broken into the cabin of Casey Jones, 20 miles from Little Lava Lake. There was no description of the men, and their presence was only made known by their tracks in the snow. Another suspect was a lone man carrying a pack and gun and wearing webbed snowshoes, who had visited a logging camp in early January. He was described as tall, dark, weighing about 180 pounds, and apparently a foreigner. Deschutes County Court offered a $1,500 reward for information. It was never claimed. The funerals for the 3 men were held together, with the Reverend F. H. Beard officiating and only immediate family in attendance. Burial was in the Greenwood Cemetery with all 3 in adjoining graves. Despite law enforcement's certainty that Kimsey was their man, they could never prove it, and so the murders of Roy Wilson, Dewey Morris, and Ed Nichols remain unsolved to this day. Some believe Kimsey had help, others think he acted alone. Whatever the case, the blood in the snow, the bodies hidden beneath the ice, and the strange silence of the Cascades keep the mystery alive, a chilling reminder of a crime that's still whispered about a century later. If you have any thoughts, theories, or comments about this case, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and may the truth reveal itself in the shadows.